This idea would allow Newcastle United to spend £500 million when their club only generates half of that. How is that sustainable? How is that fair? And how does that improve the competitive balance for teams that don't have owners with that kind of risk profile or access to resources like the PIF fund that Newcastle do? Another day in the Premier League, another suggested, debated, discussed potential change to financial fair play and profit and sustainability. This one is more confusing and convoluted in nature than the previous, as even Kieran Maguire, football finance expert Kieran Maguire, struggles to determine whether or not this intended addendum is going to maintain itself as a bolt-on to the changes that were agreed last month in principle but are yet to be ratified, or whether or not this is going to replace the intended changes and, in essence, completely erode any value in what profit and sustainability rules were intended to achieve back at its genesis. We're going to talk about it right now. We've got a brilliant article to go through that breaks everything down in detail. I'm going to give you my take and give you some of the teams that are going to be affected by this, to the positive if it happens, and to the negative. If you enjoy football finance content, guys, then hit the like button. If you like that sort of stuff and you want to check out what else we've got going on, then hit the subscribe button on the channel, hit the notification bell, and drop a comment. Let me know your thoughts on today's video. For those of you that have been around here for a while, I do apologize for not bringing any more updates over the last month. I've been super busy, but I'm back at it. So expect more and more of this channel to appear in your feed. Guys, let's start, I guess, at the start and talk about what's going on. So this is from inews.co.uk, and it's written by Mark Douglas, their Northern football correspondent. And it starts with the new FFP rule that could damage the Big Six, but boost clubs like Newcastle. Anchoring is designed to make Premier League more competitive, with all 20 clubs poised to vote on the proposals. We're going to talk about what anchoring is. Essentially, it's a hard wage cap in principle, but in reality, as I say, it kind of just negates the entire purpose of PSR for the majority of football clubs in the Premier League, if it's to be adopted and then replacing the intended changes that are yet to be ratified. Premier League clubs will debate potentially game-changing financial fair play proposals on Monday that could bring a hard wage cap known as anchoring into the English game as part of an overhaul of the league's financial fair play rules. Squad cost controls are being introduced, but now it has emerged that Premier League clubs will debate a system called anchoring, which would cap the richest club's wage bills as a multiple of the television money earned by its bottom club. Sounds complicated, don't worry. I'm going to explain it for you in a short time. Critics argue that it may harm the financial dominance of the Premier League, but advocates say it will ensure there is a competitive balance. Initial thoughts here. FFP, financial fair play, sounds like it's more around ensuring a competitive balance, a level playing field. Profit and sustainability rules, which was the kind of new acronym, the new naming convention for what these financial constraints mechanisms were pivoting towards, sounds like it's more around making sure that clubs do not get themselves into financial hardship, do not face the prospect of going out of business through rampant spending, uncontrolled spending, ambitious owners spending beyond the football club's means, and essentially, if it not working out, then a scenario where you fail to make ends meet. And we see scenarios where clubs go out of business, as we have done frequently across Europe over the last 10 years. Here is what we know and how it will impact aspiring clubs like Newcastle United. The Premier League is currently in the process of overhauling their profit and sustainability rules, and clubs agreed earlier this month to adopt squad cost controls that will mirror those being introduced by UEFA. Under those terms, clubs in Europe will only be able to spend 70% of their total revenue on wages, transfer payments, and agents' fees. Clubs not in Europe will be able to spend 85%. Just to give you a bit more detail on that, at the moment, the clubs that qualify for Europe this season, or that have participated this season, have a 90% cap. So whatever the club generates in revenue, 90% of that number can be spent on those three things. 80% next season, and then in the 25-26 season, it will be 70%, which is where the cap will, at least according to the current rules, will finish. So teams that are playing in Europe will not necessarily have to worry too much about adhering to the intended Premier League rules, which are at 85%, because they'll already be having to adhere to stricter rules if they want to participate in Europe. But for the teams outside of Europe, they will have to adhere to an 85% cap. Sources have told the Premier League, sources have told that the Premier League want their financial fair play regime to be multi-layered, and that means other ideas that could run concurrently are being debated by clubs. That can run concurrently. Important phrasing here. Remember this as we go into it. A so-called luxury tax where clubs pay large fines that could be distributed to other clubs that are compliant if they breach FFP limits was floated. However, it did not have sufficient support to get any further than the discussion stage. In terms of the Premier League, the Premier League clubs vote on a consensus mechanism, and essentially any changes to the rules regarding basically anything that affects them, broadcasting rights, TV distribution, money that filters through the pyramid into the footballing league, all of that stuff is agreed by the clubs. So the chairmans get together and they discuss and hash out with their lawyers the pros and cons of any kind of scenario. And then 15 of the 20 clubs have to approve or have to vote in favor of a certain movement. And if so, then those rules become a statute in law that will take place in a certain season in the future. Anchoring, though, is believed to have significant backing and will be debated by clubs at a meeting on Monday. The Premier League say they want to have their new financial rules agreed between clubs by June. A point to note, none of this will take effect this summer when clubs will have to comply with the existing PSR. It would operate a so-called shadow legislation next season and come into force for the 25-26 season. So next season, it's the same loss-based forces that are being audited. So teams that were affected this year, Nottingham Forest, Everton, Leicester, they are going to have to adhere to the current rules where you can't spend or can't lose any more than £105 million over a 3-year period. For Leicester, it's restricted again because they're just getting promoted, but that's for a different conversation. In a nutshell, next season, the same rules as currently apply will apply. The season after that, the intended changes will take place. So for the next transfer window, clubs close to the PSR limit, and there are a few with Chelsea, Newcastle, Arsenal, and Nottingham Forest, all rumoured to be sailing close to the win. I'll also throw in Wolves, Fulham, and Aston Villa. Will have to cut their cloth accordingly, even if new rules are around the corner. What is anchoring? The idea behind anchoring is to maintain the Premier League's competitive balance, which is a huge selling point across the globe. The fact that any team can beat any team, see Everton's defeat of Liverpool on Wednesday night, for example, is central to the popularity of the league. Well, you can make that argument, but you could also point to the fact that Mark Goldbridge walked off of his stream on Thursday night when Man City were up 3-0 against Brighton at half-time and justified his early night by talking about the kind of inefficiencies of the Premier League rule setters in that they have allowed over the last 25 years a situation where Manchester City can become that dominant that they can, put a team like Brighton to the sword by half-time and essentially make certain games uncompetitive and not worth watching. If one of the biggest criticisms of the current PSR regime is that it cements the advantage of the top six, anchoring is one possible solution. If anchoring was introduced, it would mean no team in the league could spend more on squad costs than a multiple of the club that earned the lowest from the centralized broadcast and commercial deals. Squad costs are made up of the first team wage bill, amortized transfer fees, and agents' payments. Last year's cap would have been £518 million, which no club barring Chelsea exceeded. This is where it gets confusing. Football expert Kieran Maguire, and when Kieran Maguire talks, I always listen. Anchoring is trying to set a form of limit, he says, on the gaps between the poorest and the richest clubs in the Premier League. You would take the budget for the club that is deemed to be the smallest. So for this season, it would be Burnley or Bournemouth. And you say the amount of money that can be spent by the richest clubs would be linked to Burnley's budget on a multiple. So far, the multiple we've seen discussed is 4.5 times. So if Burnley spent 100 million on their costs, on player costs, the richest club would then get a budget of 450 million. So essentially 4.5 times the revenue that Burnley gets from broadcasting deals and commercial deals would be the cap. But this is where it's confusing. It's fair to say PSR is not popular acronym at St. James's Park. So far, it has held back Newcastle, leading to a dry January in the transfer window and acting as a drag on improving the squad. The club are understood to be close to their PSR limit, most likely necessitating sales before the end of the financial year on the 30th of June. So would anchoring be more of the same potential pain for the Magpies? Not necessarily. Maguire says, I don't think clubs such as Newcastle will be hit by this. To a certain extent, it would be to their advantage. listen, if what he's about to say comes true, it wouldn't be to a certain extent. It would be to the most amazing extent possible, given the willingness, the ambition of Newcastle owners, the fact that they have more money in the ground than is probably in existence, tells you that if these rules were to come in, as I'm about to explain, then they would be happy to take advantage of them, happy to spend, and they would be able to close the gap on the teams above them. Not so much for other teams who have owners who look at, making ends meet as a priority. Teams like Tottenham, I'm a Tottenham fan, chairman like Daniel Levy, who think it's important for clubs to make ends meet and to live within their means. They would be absolutely distraught at this potential change coming in if it was to overrule the intended changes of what was agreed last month. We're going to carry on. To a certain extent, it would be to their advantage, because if the upper limit clubs can spend is anchored to the smallest clubs, it means that not only can the existing elite, Liverpool and City and so on, spend 4.5 times Burnley's budget, it allows aspiring clubs like Newcastle equal that level of payment. And therefore, you can see the benefits to them. The upper ceiling is much more closely aligned. One of the criticisms leveled at the soft wage cap at present is because it's linked to revenue. If you have an existing revenue advantage over another club, it's reflected in the wages you can pay, 100%. So take a look at Manchester City. Their revenue is £700 million. 70% of that is 490 million, which is your wage and amortization bill. Newcastle's revenue is 250 million. So they have 175 million as their wage and amortization bill. Massive difference. I agree that the system doesn't really help the smaller clubs unless they have a ridiculously easy access to generating significantly more revenues than they currently do, which no teams do. If they can, they probably have, and they can't. So in the squad control rules, which UEFA have introduced and the Premier League looks to set to introduce, the current gaps are maintained. Under the anchoring rules, they disappear. A club at the bottom, Forest, Villa, Newcastle, West Ham, if the owners want to go for it, they can. So depending on what blend of rules or eventually gets the nod, anchoring may end up being a good thing for the Premier League's disruptors. Well, is it? Again, if this is a replacement of the intended pivot from loss-based auditing, which Nottingham Forest and Everton and Leicester were in breach of, to squad cost auditing, which, as I say, the top 7 or 8 teams that already play in Europe will already have to adhere to those rules anyway. And as a separate note, if you are interested, remember that if Chelsea had won the Carabao Cup final, then given their proximity to FFP in its current state and likely failure to meet UEFA rules, they apparently could have just declined the invitation into the Conference League next season should they have qualified for it on the day Liverpool won anyway. But the vast majority of teams that are going to play in Europe have to adhere to stricter rules than the Premier League's rules intended changes will require. But under this pivot, if it removes that whole UEFA kind of idea and just focuses on a multiple of the lowest revenue generating club, then it essentially removes the entire purpose of PSR and FFP in the first place, which, as I recall, was not necessarily about leveling the playing field and allowing sugar daddies who have bought into clubs that are not the top right now, but could be if the rules didn't exist, like Newcastle. The rules were brought in to stop sugar daddies taking advantage, and that as a byproduct benefit of that would hopefully improve the competitive balance. But the competitive balance wasn't the genesis of the concept. Financial fair play and sustainability was, which was supposed to maintain a scenario where clubs couldn't spend more than they generated and put the entire existence of the club as a going concern at risk. This idea would allow Newcastle United to spend £500 million when their club only generates half of that. How is that sustainable? How is that fair? And how does that improve the competitive balance for teams that don't have owners with that kind of risk profile or access to resources like the PIF fund at Newcastle do? I'm not saying this as a fan of Tottenham who has an owner who believes that a football club should only spend what it generates. I'm saying this as a fan of football because 99% of football clubs do not have owners who have a risk profile that encompasses wealth beyond all reasonable levels. So this change, if it is a Replacement to the PSR pivot will essentially benefit teams like Newcastle, teams like Aston Villa, teams like West Ham, who have wealthy owners who are waiting, if possible, to spend money that the club doesn't generate. But it will certainly harm more clubs than it benefits. And in terms of re-establishing a competitive balance, I don't believe it. What I would say is that if this is a bolt-on to the intended changes, then I'm far more on board with it as a concept, because what that would envision is a scenario where if a team like Manchester City rose their revenues to £1 billion a year, which is not that far beyond the realms of possibility, and a team like Burnley or Leicester or whoever it was that will be in the Premier League in the 25-26 season, and when we look at the lowest generating revenue clubs, if they were only to generate £150 million or £100 million, then a 5 times multiple would mean that, in spite of the fact that Manchester City are generating £1 billion, and they could then, under UEFA's rules, spend 70% of that, or 85% to adhere to the Premier League rules, i.e. 700 million or 850 million pound, they would only be able to spend a multiple of the lowest generating club. So in that scenario, they would be essentially limited to a 50% spend, 500 million pound, in a world where they would generate £1 billion. So to me, in any scenario, this particular ruling doesn't suit Manchester City. It doesn't suit teams that have already got to the point where their revenue is close to or exceeding that threshold anyway. But it certainly would reduce the ability for Manchester City to accelerate their competitive advantage over everybody else, which I do believe is in favor of sustainability rules. Not dismissing the fact that they do acknowledge and that they do argue that, and we're going to come to it here, that doing this in the Premier League but not making those same rules apply to teams in Spain, Italy, Germany, France, etc., will essentially disrupt the playing field of competitive balance in the European competitions. So will it get through? One source told I that a majority of clubs are currently in favour, although Monday's meeting, when the practicalities of the idea will be thrashed out and discussed, is likely to make up minds. Another executive pointed out that it might not have that much impact on most clubs. One of the multiples being discussed at the moment is 5 times, which means the cap would be far in excess of 500 million. Even City and United only spent 501 and 450 respectively in the 2022-23 season. Newcastle's squad cost 230 million, giving them serious scope for improving under the anchoring system. As with so many things in football, the spectre of litigation looms over any decision to adopt it, with some Premier League clubs claiming these rules might fall foul of competition law. Whether this is tested in court is another matter. It's also important to note the PFA and agents would likely oppose any form of anchoring that reduced their clients' ability to earn. The Premier League will have to consult with the PFA clubs if the clubs are to vote to back it, although those feel like debates for the future. What I would say is this is described at the very start of the article as a hard wage cap, but in essence, I don't see it as a wage cap at all. If anything, I see it as an entire removal. Here we go. Could bring in a hard wage cap known as anchoring. I see it as an entire removal of any kind of wage cap for 19 out of 20 clubs in the Premier League. No other club will be affected by the threshold cap other than Manchester City, and that will require them to have to accelerate their own revenue in order to fall foul of the rules, assuming that Burnley's revenue things stay the same, which is, there's no guarantee on that. The only way that this is a cap is in a scenario where it's bolted onto the as an addendum to the intended changes. But like I say, Kieran Maguire is suggesting that that's not the case. He's suggesting that there's a world where it might replace the already previously approved intended changes. And given the fact that that might appeal more to the lower half teams, and given the fact that only 15 out of 20 teams need to vote in favor of an amendment to the rules in order for it to take place and to be set in stone, you might see a scenario where there is some collusion among the teams in the bottom half of the table who have ambitious owners who want to spend more but are not currently allowed to, and then other teams at the top end of the table who don't have ambitious owners or don't have owners who want to put their money in their pocket or take on more debt or risk. Then they're going to be overwhelmed and outvoted. And in the end, for me, this is not a movement towards sustainability. It's certainly not a scenario that's going to reduce the likelihood of Leeds United type scenarios playing out in the next 10 years. It's going to increase that scenario if certain owners get too ambitious, make poor decisions with their recruitment, and ultimately get themselves in trouble. Seems like Newcastle United spending 500 million when the club only generates 250, to me, is a movement back to a bygone era before Roman Abramovich came into Chelsea and that he took advantage of. So let me know your thoughts, guys. I mean, look, if it's a replacement of the rules that are intended to change, then I'm completely against it. I'm not just saying that as a Tottenham fan, because I know that we have an owner that will not put his hand in his pocket and spend more than the club generates. I'm saying that as a fan of football. I agree that the PSR and FFP rules as they currently sit don't really help smaller teams. I agree that it already kind of cements the top six, or specifically maybe one or two teams in the top two or three that have the willingness to go about things a certain way and that took advantage of the rules before they were in place and are still now getting the juice from the squeeze of those particular periods. And I do want to see teams like Chelsea have to face the consequences of overspend and not seeing the success that is generated from it, rather than keep hearing about loopholes around hotels and selling of assets to third parties that are essentially owned by the same overarching company. I don't want to see any of that. I know it's a game of cat and mouse. I know it's a game of you set a rule and people are trying to find a way around it. And I know that ultimately, when you have a system in the Premier League where the teams are voting by majority consensus for what's best for the Premier League, then you have, more often than not, a scenario where turkeys are voting for Christmas. Of course, they're not going to. So it's a difficult juggling act. Lots of plates to kind of spin, lots of arguments and ideas to consider. But for me, this idea of anchoring only works if it bolts onto the intended squad cost ratio and changes that will happen in this season after next. If it's a replacement for that, then you might as well scrap the entire FFP PSR ruling altogether, because it is essentially that in its essence. It is allowing teams that have owners who are not looking to make ends meet. They are working to a different criteria and a different goal, take advantage. And all you will see in that scenario is more and more wealth funds, more and more trillionaire or significant billionaire owners. You will see more and more private equity groups and oil nations step into the Premier League, purchasing every club, and it will become a race to the bottom. Let me know your thoughts, guys. And also in the comments, let me know the team you support, how this you think will affect you, and whether you're in favor for it. Like, subscribe, and comment for more. See you on the next one.